We're going to share the screen, get set up here. Wait 1 second, Mark. Okay, you're ready. I can see you clearly now. Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a good day. My name is Mark. My last name is McGuire. And welcome to the presentation about best practices for 10 days and beyond, connecting with the deaf and hard of hearing. Okay. This presentation is in American Sign Language, or ASL. We have ASL interpreting, and we also have English captions are also provided today. Make sure the captions are working. Again, sorry about that. Wow. I was experiencing technical difficulties with no captions and without any sound. Wow. Whew. So I'm curious, how did you feel in that moment? What, with your experience, if the presentation continued without sign, only with sign, without sound, and without captions? How was you thinking? Maybe were you feeling confused or scared possibly, or feeling like you might not be able to participate, right? Maybe even a feeling of isolation or frustration. And please understand that this is how deaf and hard of hearing people feel when they cannot participate and join and have accessible events. So let's try this again and think about that. Think about captions and sound and making sure it all works, okay? Access check. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Is it working? Yes or no? Yes? Yes. Oh, so you could receive me? You could understand what I'm saying and hear me? Yes? Yes? Okay, wonderful. That's great. Okay, now proceed. So we're going to be talking about the best practices for inclusion. Now, please understand that there are no just exact right answers, but there are wrong ways. Okay. Well, let's talk about recognizing diversity. Deaf and hard of hearing people, they have the right to be able to choose their own identity, how they self-identify. And if you're not sure how somebody identifies, then ask the person directly. Some of the common identities within the deaf and hard of hearing community, let's talk about those. We have a variety of different identities. The first one would be uppercase deaf, and then lowercase deaf, and then latent deaf. We have also hard of hearing, and some people identify as hearing impaired. So I just want to do a quick moment to expand on some of these common identities and share something with you about capital D and lowercase d. Let's talk about that for just a moment. So big D means it's within the community itself. We use sign language. That's our preference of how we use for language. We identify our culture as a deaf person. It's similar how somebody might, for example, identify as an American, right? And they use a capital A for American because it's their culture. But a lowercase d for deaf represents more of a medical terminology, using to identify people with a variety of severe all the way to profound hearing loss. Just wanted to make sure we talked about the differences. Again, if you are unsure, ask the person themselves how they identify. I will expand on this. It's okay to ask. There's nothing wrong with asking. What makes people feel valued if you ask them and don't assume? And they will appreciate you asking just to make sure that you're understanding how the individual identifies themselves. Okay. We need to recognize exclusion. The best solution starts with asking who we are excluding from the conversation. The wrong way is we don't want to assume. We don't want to assume that everybody hears, or don't assume that captions work for everybody. And we don't want to assume that everybody knows and understands what the discussion is about. Okay? When we are preparing for the event, best practices. We want to set up a plan, right? We want to make sure that we're for different steps. The first one is to be able to build an inclusive team. You want to offer multiple accommodations. You also want to consider having a deaf awareness training or workshop. And lastly, you want to consider where and how you are hosting your event. Best practices for marketing the event. Growing your audience. That's key. Announce the event on your website. And also you can post about the event on all of your different social media networks. You're going to want to ask your peers as well, or your colleagues, to help share the event with their own networks. Email or tag anyone that you know who is deaf or hard of hearing, so they know the event is coming up. And also identify the deaf communities in their area and let them know about the event. Okay. So when we're using text announcements with icons, this event will be hosted with American Sign Language. Here's an example. This icon here will indicate that. Or if you're going to be providing ASL interpreters for your event, then you will see the hands like this, the icon. Perhaps the event will contain closed captions you see the CC icon, or possibly the event contains videos with audio description to summarize AD, you would see this icon here at the bottom. It's very important for deaf-blind people. So before the event, best practices before we start the event. First of all, we want to make it easy, make it simple. First of all, you want to make sure that the content that you provided is in plain, simple language, easy to understand. They're going to also provide different ways for people to attend that could ask questions or have comments. We want to be able to also provide information on where all of the attendees can get relevant materials. You want to be able to coordinate with the language interpreters. For example, a sign interpreter or a tactile interpreter or a voice interpreter, such as I'm using right now. And you want to make sure also that all of your videos are embedded and have captions that are accurate. Lastly, that's so important, is test, and then test it all again one more time to make sure that everything is going to be a good experience. Okay, so best practices during the event. To optimize the experience technical, you want to set up a technical checklist. Make sure that you have a good, stable internet connection. Pin or spotlight the interpreters next to the presenter. And you want to make sure that the captions are turned on and producing captions. And lastly, make sure that the event is being recorded so people can view it later in case they've missed something. One more part of optimizing the experience is having the etiquette or manners, we should say. First of all, you want to set up the expectations for everybody to follow the same. To expand on that, it means that if a presenter is working with an interpreter, the presenter needs to be informed about when to share, how to share the screen with an interpreter. If, for example, an event attendee has a question, make sure that you inform that raising the hand would indicate that you want to participate or share the screen in the chat or put your question in the chat. You want to also inform the attendees of resources that are available for them. Present at your own pace. Don't talk really fast or really slow to match the interpreter. The interpreter will do their job and you just present in a natural manner. Also, allow one person to talk at a time for a discussion. If you overlap, it's very confusing and it's hard to follow and it's hard for the interpreters to keep up. So ensure that we take turns. And then lastly, you want to focus on the audience, not the interpreter. I'll expand on that a little bit. What do I mean by that? The audience, it's okay if you talk or have a question for the interpreter, of course, but the focus is that we're trying to interact with the audience and not the interpreter. So don't ask questions to the interpreter that you could be asking the participants in the audience. So best practices after the event is over. Confirm the experience. Very important. Make sure you pay your interpreters. Second of all, create a post about this event that you had. You want to share on social media, and you want to make sure that when you add captions to all of the videos that you're posting, you could provide also the transcripts of all questions that might not have been answered during the event, and follow up with those answers if you weren't able to address them at the time. And lastly, have a meeting with your team so you can review all of the successes and also the failures from that event. Okay? So I just have a quote that I really want to share with you that I've memorized that's important to share, by a famous woman named Maya, last name Angelou, who is an American poet. People will forget what you've said, and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget the way you made them feel. So I really want to expand on that for just a second. Remember that how you felt in the beginning when we had the technical difficulties without sound or any captions. Remember that in the beginning? It feels like, I'm sorry. Well, that experience happened, but I hoping now that you will really enjoy and feel fully included with captions and with sign and having sound to our voice interpreter. Okay, so I just wanted to also thank Radical Partners and Catalyst Miami, also the Center for Independent Living of South Florida, and DIG, the Disability Independent Group, for their partnership. If you want more information about deaf-friendly events, you can contact Beth Wagmeister. Beth is an advocate for the deaf community. You could email her at Beth@BethWagmeister, WAGMEISTER.com. And also, you can contact myself as well. I'm a deaf inclusion specialist, and you can email me at mark@great, GREAT, accessibility, ACCESSIBLITETY.online. Okay, so this is, if you have needing any more information, happy to be able to share with you and work with you, and I can share the PDF with you as well. So if anybody has questions, we'll open it up for questions answered if we have time now. Okay, you could stop sharing the screen. And
thank you, Mark.
does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, so we have a great question from Monica, and I, in all honesty, I've heard it very often, and I know that you've thought about it as well, Mark. So for the sake of time, we're going to answer that question, and then I'm going to write down in the chat Mark's email again. And then just to remind you that if you have more questions, or if you're in need of interpreters or any kind of services, our friends from the Center for Independent Living can definitely assist and direct you the right way. So the question goes like this, Mark, and I know it will make you smile. So Monica's asking, is it okay to ask participants who have RSVP'd if anyone requires translation, captioning, or other services? And she expresses that these services are expensive for mostly the smaller organizations that do not have large budgets. So that sometimes on the organization side, it could become an obstacle to provide it if it's not going to be needed. What are your thoughts on that?
So, okay, so between Beth and I being able to answer, this information. So for example, you were to provide one of those accommodations, and it would just be for one person. I'm trying to think, you would decide which their preference would be. That way you can go ahead and you can not have to provide all of those options. It would be their preferred rather than that. And that way that you are providing that inclusion and that access. And Beth, did you have more to say about that? Yes. Yes. Also, to expand on what Mark said, it's so important that every year you go ahead and decide in your budget, your annual budget, you go ahead and make sure that you set aside those costs for interpreters, for captioning, for any of those important services that you might be using. You know, that way there's no excuse that you're not providing that accessibility. We want to make sure we're providing accessibility, equality, whether your organization is small or large, it should not matter. What's most important would be that you make sure that those individuals are supported, that you have the money for that. Perhaps you can write a grant for that. That way it's free money to be used for those resources. You can think of creative ways to find money so that everyone feels absolutely included and welcome in your events. I hope that we answered your question.
Thank you both. So Monica says that's a valid point, but unfortunately she doesn't decide the budget, right? Which is the reality of many of the people who are on the program side. But I agree that you could find creative ways. And then Monica, it depends on who the leaders are in your organization, but something that Mark said, I found very powerful. You get to decide what you want to spend your money in, but think about who are you excluding. And if you're okay with that decision,